the Year of the Bible podcast, brought to you by Belle Aire Baptist Church in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Welcome to the Belle Aire Baptist Church's Year of the Bible podcast. I'm Steve Hiller, along with Pastor Grant Gaines, and glad you're with us as we continue our journey through the Bible story. And Grant, last time we got into the book of Joshua, we talked a little bit about how God had told Israel to go in and to conquer the land that he was giving them. We're familiar with the Battle of Jericho, but there were a lot more battles ahead. And in chapter 10 of Joshua, we come across God involved in the battle that Israel is engaged in, God stepping in and affecting it so much so that he actually touches nature.
Right, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, Joshua is a book all about wars and land and occupying a place that God's bringing them into that they've been anticipating for so long. And when they get in there are all these people already there, and they're wicked. And so in chapter 10 of Joshua, you have this really amazing story of one such battle. Now, just to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, at the end of chapter 10 and the beginning of chapter 11, you have a summary. So we don't even have really a detailed description of all the battles that would have taken place as they're doing the conquest of the land. But at the end of chapter 10, you have the whole summary of the conquest of the southern portion of Canaan. Beginning of chapter 11, you have a summary of the conquest of northern Canaan and a description of all the land that's taken there. But in chapter 10, one of the battles that is elaborated on, and I think the reason will become plain here in a minute, something amazing happens in it, is that there's this alliance of kings that come against Israel. Interestingly enough, one of them is the king of Jerusalem, which will become a very important city in the people of Israel's life. Even more interestingly, the king's name is Adonai Zedek, which means Lord or King of Righteousness. And so, interesting thing there. But that king and some others come against the people of Israel, and they're doing battle. And they're doing well, but they need more time. And the sun's beginning to set. And there's this part in verse 12 where it says, "At that time Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, 'Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon.' And the sun stood still." Now, obviously, we know that the earth is rotating around the sun. The sun isn't moving. This is the way that they would have seen it. It looks like the sun. That's what we're even talking now about the sunrise and sunset. So that's the language being used. But basically, the earth stops rotating, and God extends those daylight hours. And it says he did it until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. So you see God's fingerprint on all of these battles. In the battle of Jericho, you see it in God causing the walls to tumble down. Here in this battle against all these kings, you see it in him extending the daylight hours. Now, as it goes on in verse 13, this phenomenon, this miracle, a supernatural miracle of the sun standing still, it says, "Is this not written in the book of Yashar?" We don't know exactly what that's referring to, but it's a history book. Yeah. So like even other history books around the time of the ancient Near East record the fact that there was this day when daylight hours were extended by a lengthy period of time. They record it in the same way that there's actually a lot of secular records of a worldwide flood as well. It's not just limited to the Bible. So this is one of those phenomenons that really their evidence is there for it. It says, "The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day." There's not been a day like it before or since when the Lord did something like that. And one of the things that just this shows us is something we've seen all throughout the Bible thus far, and that is that the Lord really is Lord of everything in creation, including creation itself. You see that so far in the story of the Bible in the way that God brings the people of Israel out of Egypt. He parts the Red Sea. It shows his power over that. Already in the book of Joshua, in Joshua chapter 3, does something similar at the Jordan River where it dries up, and his people cross. God shows this also in the New Testament as well. Jesus, remember the time when he's asleep on the boat and the disciples are out in the Sea of Galilee and the storm is raging around them, and he wakes up and he speaks to the wind and the waves and says, "Peace, be still," and the wind and the waves obey him. So God is showing, he is powerful even over the created order, and that he uses that power over the created order to bring redemption and salvation and victory to his people. Now, one day God's going to show his ultimate power over creation, not just in these little isolated instances like you see in Joshua 10, but one day he's going to show just how powerful he is over the created order by renewing it entirely.
Yeah.
He's going to make a new heavens and a new earth. He's going to remove everything that is fallen and cursed in it. And you see little glimpses of that here, in the book of Joshua.
Yeah. One of the things that I appreciated about getting into the book of Joshua was after a lot of law, a lot of numbers, a lot of just detail that we read in the first 5 books, we got into Joshua and there was some action. And then it feels like it slowed down again as Israel got into the promised land. And we spent a fair amount of time in this week's reading looking at how the land was to be divided with some great detail in
a lot of detail.
Yeah. Why do you think the author of Joshua took so much time to spell out how the land was to be divided like that?
Well, I'll give a couple of answers to that in terms of my take on it. And it's true. Beginning in chapter 13, after it gives you the summary that all the northern and southern parts of Canaan have been defeated, now what? Well, now we settle in the land. But how is that land going to be apportioned? And so all the tribes of Israel are given a portion of the land. And beginning in chapter 13, you see literally all the boundary markers for every single one of these portions of land. And so as you're reading through it, you're like, he's saying, from this tree to that rock to that river, is going to be for this people. And you're just reading about all of these boundary markers in the land, and you can kind of get lost in the details, and it goes on like that for like a dozen chapters.
Yeah.
I'll preach through the book of Joshua at my last church, and part of my sermon prep after I did my own study was I would listen to another pastor preach a sermon on the text that I was preaching on that day. And as I got to this portion of it, I knew I was going to cover the whole, dozen or so chapters of the apportioning in one sermon.
All in one, yeah.
And so I went to go find it on this pastor that I'd been listening to, and I couldn't find it. He didn't have a sermon on it. And so I listened to the first sermon after it, and he said, you might notice that we skipped a lot of chapters in the book of Joshua, and that's because I don't think there's really anything we can learn from them as Christians today.
Wow.
And so I thought, that doesn't sound right. I get where he's coming from as you're reading through it, but as I wrestle with that, I think that the significance of this big section on all this land, you've got talk of trees and you've got talk of mountains and rivers and the earth. It's a reminder of a theme that runs from Genesis to Revelation. And that is that God's plan has always been to have his people in his place, under his blessing. And in that place, you think about Genesis 1. How did this whole Bible reading begin? In Genesis 1, God creates the heavens and the earth. And you get a really, not as detailed as Joshua, but you get a detailed description of the animals that inhabit that earth and of the features in the land, and they're cultivating it and they're keeping it. And Adam and Eve are placed in this garden where there are rivers, where there are trees, and even Adam himself, the word Adam comes from the word for ground. Adamah is ground, and Adam is the word for the man. And he's taken from the dust of the ground. There is this intrinsic connection between humanity and the earth that we're called to have dominion over. And so God's picture, God's goal has always been to have his image bearers in his place. That's what the blessed life is to be in God's place. Later on in Israel's history, the prophets talk about the good life this way. They say, in that day when God restores the fortunes of Israel, every man will sit under his own vine and fig tree. That's like they're saying we're going to have it made. We're all going to sit under our own vine and fig tree. We're all going to get to be in God's place under his blessing, just like it was in the Garden of Eden. And so that's what you have here. This is like the new version, the next installment of kind of the Garden of Eden idea. Now, the thing about the land is even the land is under the curse of sin. You see that in Genesis with the garden and God saying, cursed will be the earth because of you. So this promised land that Joshua is apportioning to the people, it doesn't come without its thorns and thistles. from
Right.
Genesis 3. And even today, as you think about the earth that we get to live on, it's still good in many ways. I love the outdoors, love enjoying creation, but it's not perfect. We've got right now, as we're filming this, they're calling for some snow and some bad, severe weather coming up. We see tornadoes and we see hurricanes and natural disasters. And it's a reminder that, God's plan is to have his people in a place and enjoy it. But we're not to the ultimate fulfillment of that yet, because even this place has fallen. So it's not really till you get to the New Testament. And let me just read one passage here. This is from Romans chapter 8, and just listen to what Paul says about future glory and how land, like you read about in Joshua, is going to be part of that for God's people. He says, I consider that, this is Romans 8:18, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that's to be revealed to us. Now, what's that glory? What's the glorious life going to be one day in Paul's mind? Well, he goes immediately to creation, to the land. He says, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God." Literally, Paul is saying that this earth, the same land and more that Israel inherited in the book of Joshua, that still groans under the curse of sin, that curse is going to be broken and lifted one day. And one day, Revelation 21 and 22, we'll get to inhabit a new heavens and a new earth, a renewed heavens and a renewed earth, where, just like you read in Joshua 13 and following, there will be trees and mountains and rivers and landmarks that we will know for the rest of eternity. So I do think this big portion right here in the middle of Joshua really just reminds us of God's picture of the blessed life, that it includes being in his place.
Yeah, I love that. But as you pointed out a few moments ago, as they went into that place, it was still a place that was corrupted by the thorns and the thistles and by the people who lived there.
That's
and
right.
One of the commands that God gave to the nation of Israel was, as you go in and take possession of the land, drive out or eliminate those who live there now. Israel was one of the tools, in a sense, in God's hand to punish the sin of the nations who had been there previously. And so Israel goes in, and they drive out some of the people who were there, but not all of them. What are your thoughts as we get into the book of Judges and we see Israel somewhat following God's plan?
Yeah, well, the book of Joshua is about how they get in there. They have a great leader in Joshua. The book of Judges tells the story of what happens after Joshua and all these other leaders that come onto the scene who are these judges. And the thing that they're constantly having to deal with are the consequences for not obeying God completely. And so beginning there in Judges 1, that's what you're reminded with. Judges begins by setting the context for this book, which is, Manasseh did not drive out these certain inhabitants, and Ephraim did not drive out these certain Canaanites, and Zebulun didn't. So all the tribes failed here.
Right.
And so as they're going to their apportioned land, when they get there, there's still some secondary little skirmishes and battles they're going to have to do to finish driving out. All the major battles have been done, but there's still these little local tribes still kind of in their land that's been apportioned to them. So they're supposed to get there, and their tribes are supposed to clear out the rest of the land. Well, they don't do it. They take the easy road out. Some of them may make alliances with some of these people. So, hey, these are actually friendly folks, and God warns against that because these Canaanites are very wicked. And remember, the Lord tells them, even in the book of Deuteronomy, don't think that I'm just giving you this land because you're righteous. I'm giving you this land because they're wicked. And part of what God's doing in Joshua and Judges is he's not just giving Israel land, he's taking it away from a very wicked people in a kind of Sodom and Gomorrah fashion. And so, but they lead these wicked people, and that becomes really, their downfall in a couple of ways. First, because they become bad influences on them, and they begin to worship these pagan people's idols. And second, they become their captors all throughout the book of Judges. And so that kind of leads us to this cycle that you see all throughout the book of Judges, where it's the same pattern over and over and over again. Israel sins. Sometimes it's because they commit idolatry, like the pagan nations that they left, that they didn't drive out. God allows them to be oppressed by those Canaanites that they left in the land. The Canaanites take them over. The Philistines and others
Right.
take them over. Then they cry out for help, just like they did when they were slaves in Egypt, and God raises up a judge, which is a deliverer, to save them. But once that judge dies, they fall right back into their sin, which just shows us, a couple things. It shows us that we need to obey God completely.
Yeah.
And when he tells us to do something, we need to do it all the way, or else we're going to leave a problem there that will come back to haunt us. It shows us that we need a leader. And none of these judges are the ultimate one, not even Joshua,
Right.
who, by the way, Jesus is sort of the Greek or name for Joshua. The Hebrew name for Jesus is Yeshua. It's Joshua. Jesus is the true and greater Joshua, but he's also the true and greater judge. He's the one that really comes and breaks us out of this cycle that humanity is caught in the book of Judges and elsewhere as well.
Yeah. Well, as we get into the book of Judges with this week's reading, we begin to see that cycle take place. And next week, we're going to see that continue over and over and over again. But I personally have found as we got into the book of Judges, the reading got a little bit easier because the narrative moves a little bit faster and there's a little bit more action. So maybe you've fallen behind just a little bit. I think the reading gets a little bit easier, maybe a little bit more enjoyable. So if you're behind, that's okay. You've got time to catch up. You can also go back and you can binge any of the podcasts on whatever platform you've connected on, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcast or our YouTube channel. Hope you'll do that. Also, other resources available at our website. It's belleirebc.com/Bible. That's belleirebc.com/Bible.
Thank you for listening to the Year of the Bible podcast. For more information about Belle Aire Baptist Church, go to belleirebc.com.